Hi, my name is Josh Ryor. I'm the Director of Utility Programs and Initiatives at the Connecticut Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. I'm going to talk today about some new solar programs and a potential new storage program coming out of Connecticut. But before I get there, I do have to give our typical disclaimer that anything that I express here today is not necessarily the view of the authority, and it's just my own thoughts, and also this presentation shouldn't be taken as legal advice in any way. So before I actually get into the solar and potential storage program, I want to set the stage by talking about PURA's Equitable Modern Grid Framework. So really that's our take on grid modernization. And we released back on October 2nd of 2019 our framework for an equitable modern grid that laid out a series of dockets and investigations that would further an equitable modern grid in Connecticut, but also a dynamic process for iterating on those reopeners and those investigations through an integrated distribution system plan. And I think the most important thing, though, to take away from that framework for the two programs that I'll talk about today are the objectives of the framework. Well, we laid the framework and the objectives out specifically thinking about those 11 investigations that I just mentioned. Really, these objectives and our vision for equitably modernizing the electric sector goes beyond just those 11 pathways, but really into everything we do, including the solar and potential storage program that I'm going to talk about today. So just real quick, the four key objectives of the framework that we identified back in October of 2019 were to enable an economy-wide decarbonization and really to make sure Connecticut's on a path to meet our economy-wide 2050 goals, to provide a more resilient, reliable, and secure commodity. Obviously, there's new challenges with that as we move forward. To advance energy affordability, not necessarily to lower rates, but to advance the conversation around affordability and offerings that can help enhance energy affordability. And then the last one is to support the growth of the in-state green economy for Connecticut. So while these objectives at times can be at odds with one another, our overall objective or our aim with everything we do in the electric sector through PURA is to move forward all four of these objectives. So with that context, I want to first talk about the new solar tariffs and the new solar program that's been authorized by PURA and will start effective January 1, 2022. So these new programs come out of Connecticut Public Acts 1850 and 1935 for all of you that want to look at the legislative history. And we officially made our final decision, PURA made our final decision on what the program design would look like back in February in the docket that's listed there. But what I want to highlight and what was interesting about, or there's several things that were interesting about this, but there's actually two tariff offerings that were required by the statutes. And one is a buy-all or buy-all, sell-all is known by in some jurisdictions, and then also a more traditional netting tariff option. So both of those options will be available for residential customers starting January 1, 2022. And why I think that's important to highlight at the beginning is that's uncommon. It's clearly uncommon and unique for a state to have both offerings on equal footing in the same jurisdiction. So I think we see it as an interesting opportunity to see where different tariff designs and structures might actually work for different types of customers and different business models. And we see it as a key learning opportunity for us over the next 6 years, which this program is authorized to run for. I also at the outset want to talk about the objectives of the program. PURA and the stakeholders that were involved in our process really had a concerted effort at the beginning of this proceeding to outline what the objectives were for the program so that we could design the program around that and really find areas of consensus so that when we reach the final decision, more likely than not, all of the stakeholders that were engaged, were comfortable with the outcome. So the five objectives that we have listed here are the sustained orderly development of the in-state solar industry, which is something taken from legislation as far back as 2011 in Connecticut, and also the objective to meet 100% zero carbon grid by 2040 in Connecticut, which comes from Executive Act, the Executive Order, 3. What I want to highlight with those first two objectives is really the authority's takeaway from that was that really at a minimum, this program should on a going forward basis ensure that the state is deploying at a minimum the historical levels of deployments, annual deployment of residential solar in the state. So for context, Connecticut deploys about 50 to 60 megawatts of residential solar per year over the last few years. And so moving forward, the program design was really built to ensure that that level of deployment at a minimum is maintained. So then moving to the next objective, balancing ratepayer costs and benefits, it then becomes a question of how do you achieve that objective and that deployment target at least cost to ratepayers. So we really focused on developing a process and methodologies that would annually update the tariff rate to ensure that we were meeting our goals, but at the least cost to customers. The fourth objective was really around consumer protections, and that takes two forms. One is simplicity in program design, and the second one is in explicit measures for consumer protections. And then lastly, and most importantly, really in line with our Equitable Modern Grid framework, we had an objective of increasing inclusivity and access for LMI customers. So just quickly to highlight a few other program elements, we purposely allowed for the tariffs to be flexible for oversizing systems to accommodate fuel switching and switching to electric vehicles. In terms of consumer protections, we authorized a specific educational website that will have installed cost information and the customer disclosure forms to ensure that customers have all of the information they need. Like other jurisdictions, we included an LMI adder, but we also have important benchmarks that we're going to be reviewing in terms of participation to ensure that we are actually meeting our inclusivity goals. And then the last thing I'll highlight on this slide as well is there's a unique option that we are able to leverage and we think will help with some of our LMI targets and benchmarks, which is a direct payment option. So with the buy all tariff, customers can actually choose to, instead of receiving compensation directly, they can provide that compensation or sign that compensation away to a TPO. Which we think is an interesting model because effectively the EDC becomes the off-taker, and of course they're highly creditworthy off-taker, and so may be able to overcome some of the perceived concerns around creditworthiness in low to moderate income customer communities with residential solar programs. So we continue to evaluate and develop the specific details around the program administration, as I mentioned there. And then the last thing I'll highlight before I move on to talking about the storage programs in Connecticut or the potential storage program in Connecticut, is that the final tariff rates will be established in November of this year for calendar year 2020. And again, with the aim of deploying roughly what the state has historically next year. And then we'll have an annual cycle to reevaluate the rate and set that for the next year and so on and so forth. Great, so moving on to the potential statewide storage program. Before I get into these slides, I do have to acknowledge the fact that PURA is still in the middle of an investigation on a storage program. I can talk through some of the process and the key elements that we've considered in that, but the authority hasn't yet put out a decision, so that's something to look for. But of course, I can't get too much into the details and certainly can't speak to where the authority might rule. So I want to start with, and I actually think that it's appropriate to talk about the process in this docket because we really tried to have an inclusive a more than typical inclusive process that started with trying to engage non-traditional stakeholders. For those that are familiar and those that aren't familiar with the regulatory process, it certainly isn't always the easiest thing or the most transparent or at least the easiest to understand how to operate in that. So we really wanted to lower those barriers to entry with our process, starting out with what we called solutions days, which was really an invitation to the industry, to all stakeholders that were interested, to present on ideas that they had, whether it's technologies, programs, and policies that they like from other states. So that's where we started back in 2019. We then issued what we call the request for program design proposals, or RFPDs, that really said, okay, these are all the elements from the authority's perspective that a program design would need. Give us, any stakeholder, give us your program design and how you would achieve certain objectives with that program design. And those proposals, several stakeholders, 9 in fact, provided proposals and submitted those in July of last year. The authority and authority staff then took those proposals and took all the information on the docket and other public information and turned that into a straw proposal that over the last few months we've been vetting with stakeholders to get their input on the program design to make sure we're in the right place. But again, the heart of the straw proposal was really taking the proposals that we received from stakeholders. So you can see there a list of procedural steps that we've taken since January to vet the straw proposal and to get additional feedback. And I think the key takeaway there, in addition to there's been lots of process, is that again we're still a decision or a draft decision is still pending from the authority on this. But before I close talking about the potential storage program, I do want to talk about the objectives, because I think that's of the straw proposal that went out, because I do think that that's really sets the stage for what the authority is trying to accomplish. And just a couple of things to highlight here quickly. We've had lots of conversations in our docket about what we mean by and how to measure positive net present value to all ratepayers. We've really leaned on the cost-benefit test from the energy efficiency worlds and the national standard practice manuals on how to think about cost-benefit tests. So that's been a key component of our docket. And then also thinking about in number 2 here, the multiple types of benefit storage can provide, creating a program that incentivizes the behavior and the charging and discharging that we're looking for, that provides benefits to the grid and to society. But also enabling how we can make sure that we aren't taking off the table all the other benefits that storage can provide. Number 3, you'll recognize we had a similar objective in the solar tariff program. And then 4, I think, is interesting, and for those of you that follow Connecticut or are familiar with our energy and electric policies in the state, Tropical Storm Isaias hit Connecticut back in August of 2020. And really after that, there was a statewide conversation about resilience and what that meant and how we could improve customer resilience. And I think what that has turned into is a real focus through the storage program on the straw proposal of focusing on not only low to moderate income customers, medical hardship customers that need electricity medically, but also thinking about, okay, what customers might experience longer than average outages on average during storms, or just experience outages during storms more frequently. How can we maybe target those customers to ensure that the resilience benefits of storage are being leveraged as effectively as possible? And then the last 2 objectives, lowering barriers to entry, is both in terms of program design, in terms of simplicity and the types of incentives that might be designed, but just also simpler than that. What are some things that currently the market is having trouble entering? What are some of the barriers to current entry, and how can we address those? And then also maximizing long-term environmental benefits of storage. I think we're starting to have a conversation around what hours is it do we want to target to ensure that we're maximizing the carbon reductions that are possible from storage. So with that, those are some high-level things that we focused on in our investigation. Like I said, the draft is forthcoming. One important thing to note, of course, we continue to monitor the implementation of FERC Order 2222 by ISO New England, which of course will need to interplay with any potential program that's designed for the state of Connecticut for storage. And then lastly, the target date, at least for the straw proposal for this program to get off the ground, would be January 1.